In this video, I will begin discussing the endocrine system, and we will start with the glands that are located in the head, in the brain. These will be the pineal, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. This video will specifically be over the hypothalamus. So in this image, we have a sagittal section of the brain. You can see the hypothalamus here. The hypothalamus is considered to be a neuroendocrine organ because it functions in both the nervous system and the endocrine system. So if you remember from Anatomy and Physiology 1, in the autonomic nervous system chapter, you probably learned about the hypothalamus. And that's because the hypothalamus has several autonomic nervous system functions. It also has endocrine functions, and the hypothalamus actually functions at the highest level of endocrine control. And it does this by integrating the activities of the nervous system and the endocrine system. And it will do this in 3 different ways. So here's an image, and this is a little bit different than the images in your PowerPoint. I thought this was a really important one because it shows a lot of different things that are extremely important. I try to minimize the amount of words, but and this has a lot going on, but it is very important. So here we can see the hypothalamus, and here are the 3 ways that the hypothalamus will elicit control over the endocrine system. The first way is that the hypothalamus will actually function as an endocrine organ by producing 2 hormones, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. On your objective list, you do have, within the box for the hypothalamus, you have the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus listed, and that is where these 2 hormones are going to be produced. So specifically, the paraventricular nucleus produces oxytocin, and then the supraoptic nucleus produces ADH. For lab, I'm not going to ask you to be able to label those, but you may need to know it for lecture. But you do not need to be able to identify those 2 nuclei for lab. So what happens is that the hypothalamus will produce those 2 hormones, and they will travel through the axons of these neurons. So the nuclei of the neurons begin in the hypothalamus. That's where the hormones oxytocin and ADH are produced, and then they will travel through the axons, and they will be stored in the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so that's the first way that the hypothalamus functions to control the endocrine system. The second way is that the hypothalamus will produce regulatory hormones, and these regulatory hormones will control the activity of the anterior pituitary. So those hormones that are produced, those regulatory hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus, will control either the secretion or the inhibition of hormones that are produced in the anterior pituitary. And we'll discuss that more when we get to the pituitary gland. Okay, so those are regulatory hormones. You have secreting hormones, and you have inhibiting hormones that are produced. And then the third way is that you have control, and this would be this is integrated with the fight or flight response of the autonomic nervous system, but you have control of the sympathetic output to the adrenal medulla. So in the autonomic nervous system, you may have learned about the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is actually considered to be that postsynaptic ganglion of the autonomic nervous system that will secrete these hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. And if you remember from the autonomic nervous system, epinephrine and norepinephrine also serve as neurotransmitters. But in this instance, where epinephrine and norepinephrine are secreted from the adrenal medulla, they are acting as hormones. So those are 3 ways that the hypothalamus will function to elicit control over the endocrine system. So by producing hormones itself, by secreting regulatory hormones that control the anterior pituitary, and then by also controlling the sympathetic output to the adrenal medulla, and thereby uh, regulating the release of the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla. The only other thing I want to mention about the hypothalamus, so I said that you do not have to be able to identify the paraventricular, the supraoptic nucleus. You do not have to know those for lab, but I do want to mention two things, and this may be more important for lecture than for lab. So there are two ways that the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland, and we'll talk about the pituitary gland in the next video. So there is a neural connection. So that's what we're looking at here. So remember, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone are produced by these neurons in or cell bodies, the neuron cell bodies in the hypothalamus, and then they are going to travel, those two hormones are going to travel to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So this is through the axons of those neurons. So this is a neural connection through tracts. Okay, so if you remember from the nervous system, you have neuron tracts that's going to be the axons of those neurons. So that's a neural connection. And then we also have a vascular connection that we'll see in this next slide. So here you can see this is the hypothalamus again, and you can see these blood vessels, these capillaries that are running to, this is the anterior pituitary. So this is a vascular connection. So if you remember that the hypothalamus produces regulatory hormones, those regulatory, and the definition of a hormone is that it travels through the blood. So these regulatory hormones will go through this vascular connection, and that is referred to as the hypophyseal portal system, and that's a special type of vascular capillary network. So a portal system is named for its destination. So you may hear the pituitary gland referred to as the hypophysis. That is the Latin name for the pituitary gland. So you may hear the hypophyseal portal system, and what that is referring to is this capillary network from the hypophysis, or from the hypothalamus to the hypophysis, or the anterior pituitary. And so through this portal system, you have these releasing and inhibiting hormones, those regulatory hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus. So for example, you have somatostatin, which is also another name for that, is growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So it inhibits the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. So those hormones will travel through the blood vessels, the capillaries, to the anterior pituitary. And that's how the hypothalamus will control either the secretion or the inhibition of hormones from the anterior pituitary. Okay, so that's a vascular connection. Again, the posterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus through a neural connection, through the axons of those neurons that start in the hypothalamus and then end in the posterior pituitary. Okay, so that is the hypothalamus. I will stop here and then pick up with the pituitary gland in the next video.